You are looking at a country larger than the entire United States. It appears on maps printed in London in 1710, in Paris in 1788, in Amsterdam, in Edinburgh, in Vienna. For over 2 centuries, European cartographers drew it without question. Its borders, its cities, its rivers, its people, and then it vanishes. Not conquered on a battlefield in a single war. Not gradually absorbed over generations. It disappears from maps, from encyclopedias, from school curricula, almost simultaneously across the Western world, sometime in the early 19th century. No official declaration, no formal dissolution, no signed treaty, just silence. So here is the question that has obsessed historians, cartographers, and independent researchers for decades. Was Tartaria a real empire? And if so, who decided the world should forget it? Let's start with what we can prove. In 1710, the French royal cartographer Guillaume de Lille published a map titled Carte de Tartarie, the map of Tartaria. It was not a fringe document. De Lille was the official geographer to King Louis XIV, one of the most respected mapmakers in the world. His work was considered the scientific standard of the era. On that map, Tartaria is divided into distinct regions. Grand Tartary, the enormous central mass, Chinese Tartary in the east, Muscovite Tartary in the north, independent Tartary in the south. Each region labeled with the confidence of a man who believed he was documenting something real. De Lille was not alone. The 1771 Encyclopædia Britannica, the first edition, one of the most authoritative reference works ever published in the English language, contains a full entry on Tartaria. It describes the territory as stretching from the Caspian Sea in the west to the Pacific Ocean in the east, from Siberia in the north to the borders of China, Persia, and India in the south. That is an area of roughly 20 million square kilometers, larger than the continents of Europe and Australia combined. The entry describes the people of Tartaria, their customs, their nomadic traditions, their social structures. It is written in the tone of a people the editors expected their readers might actually encounter. So who were the Tartars? Historically, the term comes from the Mongol Turkic peoples of Central Asia. The name itself is ancient, possibly derived from the Tatar tribes who were part of Genghis Khan's original confederation in the 12th century. After the Mongol Empire fractured, successor states spread across an enormous swath of Eurasia. The Golden Horde, the Chagatai Khanate, the Crimean Khanate. These were real political entities with real armies, real trade routes, and real diplomatic relationships with European powers. By the 18th century, the word Tartary had become a geographic catch-all in European thought, a vast, partially understood region that European powers had never fully mapped, never fully conquered, and never fully explained. And that ambiguity, it turns out, would become the seed of one of history's most debated erasures. But here's where it gets strange. If Tartaria was simply a loose geographic label, a polite name European mapmakers gave to a region they didn't fully understand, then its disappearance from maps should be gradual, logical, unremarkable. As Russia expanded east and China consolidated its western borders, the undefined space would simply get filled in. Named. Absorbed. That is not what happened. What researchers found next changed everything. In the late 20th century, historians began cross-referencing maps not just by date, but by publisher, by country of origin, by political context. And they noticed something unsettling. The disappearance of Tartaria from European maps clusters very tightly, around a specific window, roughly 1800 to 1830. That window is not random. It overlaps almost exactly with the Napoleonic Wars, the final consolidation of Russian imperial power in Siberia and Central Asia, and the beginning of what historians call the Great Game, the covert struggle between Britain and Russia for dominance across Central Asia. This is where theories diverge sharply, and where this story gets genuinely complicated. Theory 1. The geopolitical erasure the first theory is the most academically grounded. It argues that Tartaria was never a single political entity, it was a placeholder. As the Russian Empire expanded aggressively into Central Asia throughout the 18th and early 19th centuries, it became politically inconvenient for European mapmakers to acknowledge a vast sovereign region that Russia was actively absorbing. Acknowledging Tartaria meant acknowledging displacement, the forced integration of millions of people into an empire they had not consented to join. Erasing the label was cleaner. It transformed conquest into exploration. It reframed colonization as the simple filling in of a blank map. Historians like John Baddeley and René Grousset documented the sheer scale of Russia's eastern campaigns in the 18th century. The Khanate of Sibir fell to Russia in 1598. The Crimean Khanate was absorbed in 1783. Kazakh territory was progressively incorporated through the early 1800s. Each absorption removed one more piece of what maps had formerly called Tartaria. By 1820, the name had lost its political utility, and so it was retired. Theory 2. The lost civilization argument, the second theory, is far more provocative and far more contested. A growing community of independent researchers, working primarily from architectural and photographic evidence, argues that Tartaria was not merely a geographic label. It was, they claim, the remnant of an advanced pre-industrial civilization, one that built cities across an enormous territory and was then deliberately erased, not just from maps, but from collective memory. The evidence they point to is striking on the surface. 19th century photographs of cities across Russia, Central Asia, and even North America show architectural styles of enormous sophistication, cathedrals, government buildings, colonnaded public squares that appear disproportionately grand for cities that official history says were frontier settlements only decades old. How, these researchers asked, did cities founded as military outposts in the early 1800s possess elaborate stone architecture within a generation? Where did the builders come from? Where are the records of construction? Academic historians have largely dismissed this argument, pointing to well-documented construction records, European architectural export, and the straightforward fact that Russian imperial cities were built with enormous state investment and imported expertise. But the researchers pushing this theory counter that those very records are suspiciously thin for certain regions. The debate has never been fully resolved to everyone's satisfaction. Theory 3. The mapping error cascade, the third theory, is perhaps the most uncomfortable, because it places the mystery not in politics or conspiracy, but in the very nature of how knowledge is built. Several historians of cartography, including Jerry Broughton in his work A History of the World in 12 Maps, have documented how early modern European maps were frequently copied from one another with minimal independent verification. A cartographer in Amsterdam might reproduce the outline of a map made in Lisbon, which was itself based on a traveler's account from 40 years earlier, which was itself a translation of an Arabic source from 2 centuries before that. Under this theory, Tartaria's prominence on European maps was partly a self-reinforcing error. Once Delisle drew it large and authoritative in 1710, subsequent mapmakers reproduced it. The name accumulated weight not from observation but from repetition. When Russian and British surveyors finally began systematically mapping Central Asia in the early 19th century with actual measurements, with instruments, with triangulation, with rigorous methodology, the vague enormity of Tartaria had no place in the new precise geography. It was not erased. It was simply outgrown. And yet, 3 theories. And none of them fully explains the silence, because here is what all three theories fail to answer. Why do the people of the regions once labeled Tartaria, the Tatars, the Kazakhs, the Bashkirs, the Uzbeks, have such rich oral traditions describing cities, courts, and cultures that predate the period's official records assigned to them? In 2019, a team of archaeologists working in the Ural region of Russia announced a discovery that received almost no mainstream coverage deep beneath layers of sediment and later construction. They found the remnants of a settlement far older and far larger than any official historical record had predicted for that region. Stone foundations, evidence of smelting, fragments of material culture suggesting trade links with regions thousands of kilometers away. The site is called Arkaim. It was first discovered in 1987, and it is not alone. Arkaim is part of a network archaeologists have named the Land of Cities, a cluster of more than 20 ancient settlements spread across the southern Ural steppes, dating back roughly 4,000 years. They show evidence of advanced urban planning, fortified walls, drainage systems, metallurgical workshops. Who built them? Where did their builders go? The honest answer, even from the archaeologists who have spent careers at these sites, is we don't know. What we do know is that the steppe, the vast interior of Eurasia that European maps once labeled Tartaria, has been continuously inhabited for millennia. That the nomadic peoples of this region were not primitive wanderers but sophisticated cultures with complex systems of governance, trade, and knowledge. And that when the Russian Empire absorbed these territories, it did so with the deliberate suppression of local historical narratives. This is not speculation. It is documented imperial policy. Indigenous oral histories were discouraged. Local naming systems were replaced. Centuries of accumulated cultural memory were reclassified, minimized, or simply ignored in the official record. So consider the possibility that sits at the center of this mystery, not the fringe theory, not the conspiracy, but the quiet, uncomfortable historical reality. Tartaria may not have been one empire. It may not have been a lost civilization in the dramatic sense, but it was real. It was real in the sense that millions of people lived, built, traded, and died across that enormous territory. And the story of those people was deliberately made smaller to make the story of their conquerors seem larger. The maps didn't erase a name. They erased people. And here is the question that no map, no encyclopedia, and no official history has ever fully answered. If the story of Tartaria was reduced to a cartographic footnote, if 20 million square kilometers of human history was quietly relabeled as Russian expansion, what else has been simplified away? What other names are missing from the maps we were taught to trust? Somewhere in the archives of St. Petersburg, there are documents from the Russian Imperial Geographic Society that have never been fully translated into English. Somewhere in the British Library, there are survey reports from 19th century agents of the Great Game that remain partially classified. Somewhere in the oral traditions of the Tatar and Kazakh peoples, there are histories that no European cartographer ever thought to write down. The vault is not empty, it is just sealed. Tartaria may or may not have been an empire. The jury of history is still, genuinely, legitimately out. What is not in doubt is that something vast and complex existed in that space, that it was inhabited by real people with real histories, and that those histories were, at minimum, drastically simplified by the powers that came after. The next time you look at a map, any map, ask yourself one question: who drew it? And what did they need you not to see? If you want to open more vaults like this one, subscribe. We post every week. There are more sealed rooms, and we are just getting started.